Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to take a look at the much rumored and long anticipated Nikkor Z 35mm f1.2s. So this is a bit of a first look video. I had a couple hours yesterday to work with this lens, and the results are absolutely fantastic. Is it the perfect 35mm? Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit in this video. So I decided to take this lens down to the Fort Worth, Texas Stock Show and Rodeo to do the test shots. And for those who are not familiar, the Stock Show is an annual event where livestock breeders from around the country come to have their livestock exhibited, judged. In some cases, they will either sell or auction off livestock. And in this case, we're looking at the Mexican Cala de Caballo, which involves the riders bringing their horses from a run to a full stop to demonstrate the rider's control and the relationship they have with the horse. Both men and women compete in this event, and the women actually ride side saddle. It's really impressive, and this is probably one of my favorite rodeo events, and it's a major competition. So this is the latest addition to Nikon's super fast prime lenses. So when you consider this series, we have the 135mm f1.8 Plano, which is an amazing lens. We also have the 85mm f1.2, the 50mm f1.2, and now we have a 35mm f1.2. And it's also worth noting that this is actually the first time that Nikon has done a 1.2 lens in 35mm, which is kind of interesting. Now, one thing I want to point out, as with the other prime lenses I just mentioned, this is not a small lens. It's a rather large lens. It is optically very advanced. We're talking about 17 elements in here in 15 groups. So in terms of size, this is very comparable to the 50mm f1.2. It's about the same size. Those are heavy lenses. And I will say, though, however, that I shot for a couple hours yesterday using the Nikon ZF, and in terms of size, that is a very small camera. The weight is very well distributed on this lens. The weight comes in at 1,060 grams. Filter threading is 82mm, which is the same as the other prime lenses, so if you're using filters and you're using multiple prime lenses, you'll be able to swap them in and out. We do have 17 elements in 15 groups. There are 3 extra low dispersion, 3 aspherical, and 1 aspherical low dispersion element. We have 3 types of coating in this lens. We've got meso-amorphous, nanocrystal, and arneo coating, which explains why there's so many elements. There are 11 rounded diaphragm blades. The minimum focus is 0.3 meters, and it is dust and drip resistant. The drive system in this lens for autofocus does feature 2 STM motors. Performance is pretty much what you would expect out of a Nikon. It's very good, and I had no problems in autofocus with shooting. All right, so I want to look at some images and make some notes on performance. And as I said earlier, this is Nikon's first 35mm lens that comes in f1.2. The wider the aperture, the harder it is to correct, and this one does a really impressive job. So if we take a look at this image, this is done at 1.2, and you're going to notice that things that are in focus, if I zoom in, are extremely sharp, and that's exactly what you want. Subject isolation is excellent on this lens, especially when you consider that we're dealing with a wide-angle lens, and it's a little harder to isolate those subjects because as soon as you start stopping down, you're going to increase that depth of field, so you're not going to get that isolation. Another thing that I want to point out, if you look at some of these highlight areas, like in the windows over here, or even up here in the ceiling lights, there is just a hair of chromatic aberration, but this is very well controlled. On other lenses in the past, you would have seen a lot of chromatic aberration in these really high contrast areas. So this is one thing that this lens does exceptionally well. The only downsides at f1.2 that I could find, and this actually would be beneficial if you're shooting maybe portraits up close of somebody, is it does vignette. And I added a little bit of contrast in post to this image. I used one of my Kodak film presets, and so you're going to see that the vignetting does get kind of pronounced here. So along the sides you have darker edges, and in the middle it tends to be brighter. Now, as soon as you start stopping down on this lens, it does go away, even by f1.4. And so kind of that old school adage that we have where you actually would buy a wider aperture lens so you can get a better quality image at 1.4, this does that job exceptionally well. And of course, if you stop down to f2, this is one of the sharpest lenses that I have ever used. It is absolutely incredible. Another thing worth noting is that color reproduction is extremely good on this. You're going to get really bold, really good looking saturated colors. It does an outstanding job there. And the other impressive thing to me about this lens is the way that it handles distortion. So one thing to note is that I have an early copy of this lens, so there are no lens distortion profiles or corrections in Lightroom at this point. And right now it's doing a really incredible job. Lines are extremely straight, and one image that I want to show you in particular is this one, which was shot at f2 because I really wanted as much depth depth of field as I could. I wanted everything in focus. And if we zoom into these lights in the ceiling, you can see that we really have no chromatic aberration at all. This is an excellent lens. Now, another thing I want to note about this lens is despite the big size, it really does give you a lot of versatility. The look that you get when you're wide open at f1.2 is so unique and it's so well controlled. And I actually am of the school that I prefer a little bit of vignetting if you're doing portraits or if you're trying to isolate a subject. So for me, it works out really nicely. You could correct that in post-production, but I think coming straight out of the lens, it does look really good. And the versatility comes into play that you can get rid of the vignetting just at f1.4, which is around a half a stop less. And by f2, it's really pretty sharp. And so you get a lot of versatility in terms of the way you want to capture a certain look with this lens. I really liked it a lot. Now, in terms of pros and cons on this lens, one thing that I want to point out that I think is going to be an issue for a lot of people is going to be the size. This is a prime lens that's the size of a telephoto lens. And I say this because particularly when you think of 35mm, you're thinking of maybe doing street photography, more improvisational, candid types of things. For me personally, this is kind of too big a lens to use. Now, yesterday when I was shooting this, even the behind the scenes stuff, you're more in an event type situation where you have people that are participating in a rodeo that are used to being photographed backstage. So there's not so much in the way of camera awareness. This isn't really the same as street photography, but I think that size is going to limit some people if that's your intended use case. Now, if you're shooting studio images or if you're even doing events, things like that, I don't think the size is going to be that big of a deal for you. It's all going to be personal preference. It is just a reason of physics why this lens is so big. It's an f1.2 lens, and to Nikon's credit, one of the things that they've done with this is optically it is perfectly outstanding. I mean, this is one of the best f1.2 lenses at this focal length that I've ever used. There really isn't any issues with chromatic aberration, with distortion. Vignetting is a little bit of an issue, but we're talking about an even bigger lens if you wanted to get rid of that completely. And so I think they've done a wonderful job with this. That's really the only con that I can point out is the size. And this is the same issue that I had with the 50mm f1.2 and even the 85mm f1.2. But if you want that look, that size is going to be the trade-off. Now, if that is not as important to you, Nikon do have other alternatives. There's the 35mm f1.8S lens, which is excellent, as well as the newly introduced 35mm f1.4. Both are much cheaper lenses. And speaking of, let's talk about the price point. This lens will set you back just under $2,800 US. Now, I know that is a lot of money, but when you consider the performance that you're getting out of this lens and what you're paying for in that, I mean, we're talking the level that was established by Zeiss with their Otis lenses a few years ago. It really is that good, and the Otis never had a 35mm. Of course, the price is about half of what you'd pay for a Leica SL lens, and this is an f1.2. The SL lenses are aposummicron lenses, which means f2. This is really a first look with this lens. As I mentioned, I only had a few hours with the lens yesterday, able to get some test shots so we could look at the image quality. While I'm not excited about the size, I think you're getting a lot of bang for your buck for something that is really specialized, and the image quality is outstanding on here, and I am actually interested in testing this a lot more, so I will get back with you when I've had more time with that lens. And another thing that I want to mention is I'm going to be doing a lot of Nikon content this year. In terms of lenses, I think they have an interesting history of optics, and it goes way back, and they have done some amazing things, and I want to kind of dig into that some. So if there's something you guys would like to see, make sure you drop me a comment below, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.